Hi guys, it's snowed quite a bit here this week, as you just saw. So I've decorated for Christmas, I've lit a candle, and I feel justified in coming here with a big batch of winter reading recommendations. Wintry books for frosty hearts. I have quite a few different genres here in my recommendations pile. I have historical fiction, I have crime, thriller, horror. I have fantasy and science fiction, and at the end there will be a large romance section. What they all have in common is a very wintry setting. It's often a very picturesque one, or at least a classic winter landscape, but not always. Sometimes it's more of a in the bleak midwinter vibe, but most of the time it's pretty. My first recommendation is a lovely little gem of a historical novel that I've hardly ever seen being recommended on BookTube, which is a shame. It is Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, which came out in 2016. This is set in New York in the year 1746. Late in the year, a mysterious stranger called John Smith arrives by ship from London, and he has a large sum of money being sent to him on the next ship. And the reader also knows that he is on some kind of mysterious mission, that he is supposed to carry out some kind of mysterious plan. But nobody else in New York knows anything about this, and wealthy as he apparently is, John Smith gets sucked into high society and into all the intrigue in high society. It is a fun romp. It is surprising, and it is also surprisingly touching when it inevitably becomes serious later on in the book. The most memorable scene in the book takes place on Sinterklaas Eve, during Sinterklaas Eve celebrations, and there is a rooftop chase, even if I remember correctly. The second most memorable scene is a duel straight out of Eugene Onegin. This is a fantastic little gem that I think deserves much more attention. Going just a little bit further back in time, we have Frontier Wolf by Rosemary Sutcliff. This is set on the northern border of Roman Britain in the mid 4th century CE. The protagonist gets sent to this remote border guard outpost as a punishment or to atone for a very grave error in judgment that he made during his command. And as it turns out, he gets a second chance in almost an identical situation. But before it comes to that, he also makes friends with the son of the local chieftain, the chief of the Pictish clan, against whom he is in the business of defending the Roman Empire. The story really gets going at midwinter, and there's quite a bit of magic there in terms of atmosphere. But after that, you really feel how the cold and the bleakness of the wintry landscape seep into your bones if you don't have a cozy Christmassy cottage to hide in. As all of Rosemary Sutcliffe's Roman fiction, this is impeccably researched and authentic in all the details that all the other writers usually get wrong. My next book is historical horror, or rather, I would call it a psychological thriller in the truest sense of the word. It is Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. This book is written as a diary or a journal of a young man who, in the year 1937, gets sent on an expedition to a meteorological research station on a small island in the Svalbard archipelago in Norway. He goes together with a small group of other young scientists slash adventurers, and they are funded by the English, I think, the National Meteorological Society. For plausible reasons, he gets left alone in the research station and on the whole uninhabited island for a time during the long, dark polar winter, the long polar night. And there, with no one to talk to and with no natural light for weeks on end, he gets a bit of cabin fever, and all of a sudden, a disturbing ghost story that he was told on his way to the island suddenly comes to life around him. This is by far the most bone chilling horror story that I have ever read. And at the same time, it is by far the most understated one and the most realistic one and sincere one. Once again, an underrated gem, I think. From the past, we go into the far future to Pluto Shine by Lucy Kissick. This is the story of a terraforming project and a first contact story set on Pluto, but it has, I would say, an emphasis on the characters and their dynamics and their philosophies. I'm not going to lie, I had a few problems with this book, as you can see in the dedicated review video that I made of this book last year. However, it has two big points in its favor. And point one are the characters. They are amazing, so vivid, so touching. I'm still thinking of them a year and a half almost later. And the second point is, of course, the setting. Pluto hasn't yet been terraformed, and the settlers live on a station right on the icy heart of Pluto. There is little light so far from the sun, but when there is light, it is absolutely magical. Moving on to fantasy, we have Swordspoint by Kushner. This is a fantasy of manners set in a place that looks very much like early modern England in a town called Riverside. There is no magic, but there are a lot of hired swordsmen who fight the duels of the insufferable noblemen. And this is the story of one particular swordsman who has gotten himself into a bit of a pickle due to his boyfriend, who is from the aristocracy, but got tired of his oh so awfully comfortable life and of his university. And due to this horrible ennui that he felt, he decided to go slumming with the ordinary people. And now he's living with our swordsman, but not all of his relatives will leave the matter alone. When I think of Riverside, I think of hot chocolate in dainty china cups and drops of blood on new snow. From picturesque to bleak and post-apocalyptic, we have The Monster of Elendhaven by Jennifer Giesbrecht. This is set in a Nordic-like town which was ravaged by a terrible apocalyptic oil spill. And of course, as such things go, all the rich guys from the industry who were responsible for the catastrophe have pulled out and left the town to fend for itself, or to rot rather. And in the ruins of the town and among the remnants of its population, there is only one sort of member of the nobility left, who is a young alchemist sort of wizard who is working on a terrible revenge plan. He gets unexpected help from our title character, the Monster of Aln Haven, who is of similar age to our alchemist and has come straight out of the waters, the oil-infested waters of the harbor. And he's not quite right, but his past is a mystery that gets solved in the course of the book. I loved this for how messy and also for how unapologetic it was. I don't really want to say in which ways exactly, but you will find out if and when you read it. Next, we have more like classical fantasy, The Winter Players by Tanith, another novella just like The Monster of Aln Haven. I have it in this bind up called Companions on the Road, but the individual cover would be like this for The Winter Players. And this is the story of a young priestess from the middle of nowhere who leaves her shrine in order to recover a holy object that was stolen by a mysterious stranger in a grey wolf fur cloak. And she is ready to pursue him to the ends of the world, but that is not quite where the chase leads her. This is incredibly atmospheric, and the atmosphere is incredibly eerie. Tanith is just such a great wordsmith. She almost reaches Patricia A. McKillop goddess levels of wordsmithery. Not quite, but almost. And this book is incredibly addictive. I read it in one sitting during one of Lauren's cozy reading nights from Lauren and the Books, one of her lockdown cozy reading nights, and it is the most vivid memory of any such reading nights that I have from the time. It's an incredibly cherished memory of mine, and I recommend this novella to anybody who likes classic fantasy. My next book is more like romantasy, but also with a very classical feeling. It is The Fairy Hounds of York by Arden Powell. Unlike in current romantasy, the fairy in this story is not the love interest, it is the antagonist. And it is also more a classically creepy fairy. It's a really just a creepy, almost like a spirit. Our main character in this story is under a fairy curse, and he is wandering the Yorkshire countryside and in danger of being pulled into the fairy realm. He gets help from a traveler, a capital T traveler, whom he meets during his wanderings, and the traveler is on a bit of a quest of his own. This just has the perfect frosty cold atmosphere for holiday reading and holiday decoration elements, or more specifically, solstice holiday decoration elements feature quite heavily in the scenes in this book. And now we have arrived in romance territory. I have 1, 2, 3 romances still to recommend, but the first two are still have a heavy fantasy element. The first one is another one by Arden Powell. This one, The Solstice Cabin, a very short novella, maybe even a novelette. And this one takes place, for the most part, in a cabin in the mountains off the coast of Nunavut in Canada, northern Canada. In this story, the danger and the life-threatening quality of the winter landscape in the far north is emphasized, but then when we have cozy scenes, they are all the more cozy for being offset behind or before the background of this dangerous winter landscape. And of course, there's also reindeer and sledge dogs and the northern lights. Just the perfect little solstice or New Year's Eve read. Also, not very heavy on the fantasy and the magic, we have the novella Holly and Oak by R. Cooper. This one is set in I want to say New England small town. I always think of it as looking very much like Stars Hollow. And in this town is a pagan setting in which the circle of the year is dominated by the two forces of life, the principle of life and growth and fertility, which is represented by the Oak King, and on the other hand, the principle of winter, of death, decay, which is represented by the Holly King. And it is always two men from the town who incorporate these principles and who are, chosen, selected to represent these two principles. And in the case of our story, the two men who represent Holly King and Oak King are tragically in love with one another, but are locked in this fight almost to the death, where they have to periodically suck the life out of one another and are always doomed to be in an antagonistic relationship or dynamic towards each other, until one of them thinks that it is time to say no to all of this, or at least to maybe approach things a little bit differently. Despite the cozy sounding small town setting, the story is quite serious in tone, and the yearning just seeps out of the pages, and I appreciated that about it. R. Cooper is very good at writing yearning in general. And my last recommendation for today is one of my favorite novels by Tamara Allen, who writes excellent historical romance. It is The Only Gold, and it is set in New York at the end of the 19th century. It is a heist story, but told from the perspective of a bank employee. Its climax takes place during a huge snowstorm which paralyzes the whole city, and that is why it's earned its place on this recommendations list. It is, in essence, an enemies to lovers sort of romance. Our protagonist and viewpoint character is a young man who works in a bank, and that is not just the center of his life, but it is his whole life. He is looking forward to being promoted when someone on a middle tier retires, but he is unexpectedly overlooked or passed over in favor for an entirely new hire, a mysterious stranger who comes in with some very unorthodox ideas about how his bank is supposed to be run. Unlike most historical romances, Tamara Allen's historical novels they really feel like historical novels. They really feel like they are set in the time in which they are set, and are not just fan fiction version of historical novels, as so many historical romance novels are. And that is it. I hope you take some inspiration, some reading inspiration from this list, because, as I've said a number of times, I think there are some really underappreciated, underhyped gems on this list. If you have already read any of them, I would love to know what you think about them. I'll see you again very soon, guys. Bye.